Hello, and welcome to Get Recc'd. I am your host, Stephen Falgout.
And I am your other host, Dawn Falgu. And tonight we have a spooky podcast. Oh, lightning strikes! The screen goes red. You are bleeding profusely from the eyes. Yes, our horrifying terror podcast of lots of scares on Halloween Eve, or Halloween if you live somewhere where it is currently October 31st. And on tonight's podcast, we are continuing our Get Recc'd tradition of being a podcast where two siblings, Steven and I, recommend a piece of media to each other, be it an album, a film, a video game, or whatever, and then we talk about those recommendations. Only this time, it's terrifying.
This podcast is a scary monster under your bed. You're listening to it with your ears, but your ears are deceiving you because it's spooky.
Yes, it's a monster, and it's also a ghost. It's a ghost monster.
And a vampire.
Oh my
Whoa!
god!
Don't let it get you.
Don't let it
Don't-
lick the blood that is dripping from your eyes, as I previously established. That is why the screen is red. It's because you can't see through the blood that's on the screen and your eyeballs.
And speaking of things for our screen and eyeballs, I think we have some spooky co-hosts to join us on this terrifying podcast.
We very well might. Well, as you all know from our spooky episodes, we have some spooky guests. But I gotta say, they seem absent. I was searching for them today, and I just couldn't find them. And I don't know where they went. I think they fled. I think that Get Recc'd was becoming a bit too heavy for them emotionally to handle. I think it had something to do with all of the nude scenes that they were in. Because they have no clothes. Because they're skeletons. And
Or skin.
Or skin. And I think that was really starting to weigh on them. So unfortunately, I think they're all gone. But may they rest in peace, which they already were. Because again, they are skeletons.
They're only allowed out one day a year, and in the other days, they're resting in peace.
Yeah,
I hope anyway. I mean, I don't check in on them on any of the other days, so I don't know how they're doing.
Yeah,
mentally.
No one ever asks, how are the skeletons doing? And neither do we. But I think with that, we should move into what you recommended to me, Steven, last time, if you don't mind.
Yes, in the last episode, I recommended to you the 2004 horror comedy film Shaun of the Dead. This is an Edgar Wright film starring Sean Penn and Nick Frost, two members of a comedic duo that had a British television show. The idea for this movie kind of spawned off of that show, and the two of them went on to create a couple more in sort of a trilogy of films that aren't necessarily related, but are all starring these two. So with that, I will turn it back over to you to talk about Shaun of the Dead.
Yeah, so I do really like this film, but I can't really talk about it just yet because I'm actually hearing a knock on the door, and I think somebody wants to be let in, maybe a party of individuals. Oh my God, it's Billy! Oh my God, it's Ashley and Zoe!
What?
Maurice! Oh, it's so nice to see you again. Lindsay with the violin coming in with the tunes. Mr. P coming in with whatever the fuck Mr. P's got going on. And Gary, I mean, this dude's throwing curveballs like fucking you've never seen. Same as always.
Just in time for the World Series.
And Lance with his sword. I mean, just in time for the sword fighting jousting World Series? I don't know anything about sword fighting, but somebody new has arrived, And I'm just so excited to introduce to you our hungry passenger Beatrice, who is craving your flesh.
Beatrice. It's not
Beatrice.
my flesh. My flesh isn't even tasty.
Well, I don't know who she's coming for. I mean, I would assume because she's on my head, it would be me. But what's a little odd about that is if it was me, she is already on my head, so I don't know why she would keep running. So there's got to be somebody else. But I don't know. Ask Beatrice later. And yeah, just in time as well. My new friend Glenda, who I gotta say just loves to get down. I mean, she's
Glenda
got
the Good Witch. Is she doing the monster mash? I think someone's doing the monster mash.
You can just feel the energy and passion behind her dance here. Truly an interpretive dance that brings to mind many different spirits of Halloween.
Yeah, I think, one thing about Beatrice, what I'll say is we haven't got there yet, but Beatrice is just a huge fan of Michael Myers, the SNL co-host and longtime actor. Unfortunately, what we didn't tell Beatrice is that we're looking at a different Michael Myers today.
Yeah,
But
I think we should keep that one under wraps for a bit. She might leave. Don't worry.
yeah, it was really the
Beatrice.
only way we could get her under contract, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, that'll be tragic for her when she learns the unfortunate truth that we all know is coming later. But for now, we're talking about Edgar Wright's and Simon Pegg's Shaun of the Dead. So anyway, I'm glad that our friends are here, and now we can discuss horror films. Although Shaun of the Dead, we are starting with the film that is, it's a horror comedy, and that is apt. Last time we talked about Brain Dead, which is also a horror comedy, and I will say, actually a similar film in some ways. It is a zombie comedy movie.
And you know what's spookiest of all?
What's that?
Now that we have all our friends here, everyone in Shaun of the Dead also has a skeleton.
That's probably the scariest thing anyone said to me in my life.
There's a skeleton inside each of us right now.
Oh my god, so you know what that means? That means there's actually even more skeletons than I thought there were tonight. So I mean, the more the merrier, as they say. And anyway, what I think is interesting, and this is just a very light parallel between the last episode and this one, is, two zombie comedies. But Shaun of the Dead is mocking, or at least imitating, if it isn't an explicit parody, it's at least imitating not comedies, but zombie films of its day, which are definitely not the same kind of stuff as what Brain Dead was playing off of. This is more like the 28 Days Later Dawn of the Dead remake. Of course, Shaun of the Dead, a play on Dawn of the Dead, and the title is quite funny. But anyway, much like other horror comedies or that I have seen in my life, I feel like horror comedies are really kind of just comedies. They're like, they use the dressing of a horror film, but the style and intention of these movies is usually to be funny. You're not supposed to be scared watching these movies necessarily. But that's something interesting about Shaun of the Dead that I'd like to get to a little bit later. We'll put a pin in that. Of course, this is an Edgar Wright film. I've seen a couple at this point, and he's definitely he's a director with a very unique style. Like, you kind of know an Edgar Wright film when you see one. First of all, the comedy in his films is always very, very British, mainly, especially in this one. But there's this kind of fast-paced quality to the editing in Edgar Wright films that I think is very, very essential to him. And you get that a lot in this movie. The editing in this film is really clever. A lot of the jokes really lie in the editing of the movie. Quick cutaways to related things, scenes of characters maybe flicking through the television where each, show that they flick between end up having some kind of related concept to what's going on in the movie in a funny way. Really fast timed gags. Sometimes the gags are just the edits themselves. There's this edit where it'll cut through a lot of different shots very rapidly as like this kind of funny TV show type transition, and it starts to do it in really mundane, silly ways. And so the comedy of the movie is very quick, and it's very heavily directed. You know, it's a comedy film with a real director vision behind it. And I think it's the kind of thing that translates to other movies like, you know, Baby Driver or Scott Pilgrim, which aren't necessarily completely comedies like this is. Although is this completely a comedy? Again, I'll get to that later. But it's also a very character-driven movie. Like, a lot of it's kind of a buddy comedy. And it also touts itself as being a romantic comedy with zombies in it. And it also is that. You do have like this, you know, failing relationship because, you know, Shaun is just such a loser and he has to prove himself by surviving a zombie apocalypse, you know. Very silly concept. And I'll start there, but that is something I definitely do like about Shaun of the Dead. And I definitely do think that like all of these elements working in tandem, it makes it a really funny, but also pretty relatable movie. Very character-driven comedy. And it's really good at being that. Even, you know, without mentioning or getting into all the zombie stuff yet. And I'll start there and let you say something, I guess.
Yeah, I think all of the characters here have a really great quality to them, and they're portrayed by some really fun actors like Bill Nighy's in here and some others that bring a great, just natural comedic element because they are typically kind of serious actors. So to see them in a role like this that's just so outlandish in a lot of ways is in itself pretty comedic. And then that they also just bring a great, you know, chemistry between each of the individual components. Because really, I think what's the most interesting part of this film to me is that it follows the perspective of a group of characters that aren't necessarily the heroes. Like, they are the heroes in that they're some of the only ones who kind of survive in a way. But ultimately, they're just kind of like a group of people that would be probably ancillary characters in a more established zombie film, just trying to like survive in a zombie film. And I think that's really fun.
Yeah, and it plays on tropes of zombie films of its day. You know, the disease outbreak, which I want to say was a trope started with like the Resident Evil games. I don't know if it was started with that, but I feel like that was where that trend really started. And then zombie films from then on out were about like infections and stuff, to try to ground it in a more scientific way, which this movie does. And also just the general style of the way the zombies are presented and the way like the main characters are presented, getting, you know, stuffed up in like in a pub in this movie. That's definitely a much more established thing for zombie films, but it all feels like very modern for 2004. And off of what you said with the characters not being your typical zombie film characters, they're really more like your typical like rom-com characters, which I guess is why it touts itself as a rom-com with zombies, because that basically is what it is. Like, take the zombies out of it, and you do have like a buddy comedy, romantic comedy film in a much more standard way. But when you bring the zombies into it, you end up having a zombie film with characters who are like not equipped for that kind of movie. And it makes it, I guess a lot of zombie films try to make the leads like relatable people, you know, who you feel like could be you. But that really ends up playing in this film, I think, more than any other zombie movie I can think of, you know. They're like really just everyday dorks, and it makes it very funny. And it breaks those tropes in a very clever and fun way. But one thing that I think is cool about Shaun of the Dead in particular is that it also embraces a lot of tropes of being a zombie film. This movie isn't just like a complete spoof, like something like maybe Zombieland, or hell, even Brain Dead. You know, like this movie, something interesting that it does, and this is why I was mentioning the horror comedy thing earlier, is that I feel like while I would still say this film is more of a comedy than a horror, it starts to blur the lines as the movie goes along. Like, the first act or so of this movie is just pure laughs. You know, it's completely played for a joke. It's like a funny comedy movie, and that's it. But the more that the movie progresses, the more it wants you to actually take it kind of seriously. You know, it's still a funny movie because these characters are funny, but it starts to take them seriously. It treats them as actual people in this situation, and starts to ground itself more as it goes along. There are moments later in the film that are actually pretty, pretty emotional for both a zombie movie and a comedy movie. And a lot of the reason,
tense, I would say.
And tense, yeah. And part of the reason why that works is just because it is so funny in the start that you actually do care about the characters. When it takes that stuff away, you know, you like them because they've made you laugh, which is really smart, honestly. And it does that without completely breaking the movie's tone. The tone in this movie definitely changes over time, but it doesn't completely subvert itself, you know? The whole movie still feels like a zombie comedy. It just has room to take the zombie stuff more seriously when it makes sense to do that. The stakes get raised appropriately, and the characters respond to them realistically, which I think is really unique about this movie. And I like those genre lines getting blurred. I wish more horror comedy films like took the horror aspect more seriously than they do. Not that they need to, and I'm fine with the movie just being funny. I mean, you know, we talked about Brain Dead last time. I love that movie. But it's cool to see something really try to be both. And I think that separates Shaun of the Dead from a lot of other stuff.
Yeah, and it balances the line between the two kind of themes very well too. I wouldn't say it's so split into acts where you can like find the differentiator, but I do think, you know, kind of to your point, it really bends the rules of both comedy and horror in such a way that, like, you know, it almost is split into kind of two halves. There's the half where essentially a zombie outbreak is happening around them and all of the main characters are clueless to the events, and you know that's really fun and puts it in a lot of really unique situations, things like flipping through the screens or thinking that people are drunk when they're actually brain dead zombies, and then like moving and towing that line into this once they get into the pub where it really does kind of feel like a more traditional zombie movie, and they have some really tense scenes, but those are played up for, you know, through cinematography, through soundtrack, through the just like outlandishness of some of the gore. It's still very much a comedy, but it just becomes much more tense. You know, like I think of a situation like in the pub where probably one of the standout scenes that people might remember was when the jukebox is playing Don't Stop Me Now and they're like hitting a guy with a pool stick, right? But then like it progresses to now his mom's turning into a zombie and the zombies are breaking in and they have this really tense standoff, and then the guy gets like pulled out and then the zombies like ripping all of his intestines out and everything, and all the zombies are collapsing in on them. And the way that it's able to kind of like handle all of that and still keep it pretty lighthearted and fun to watch is really great. Kind of masterful, honestly.
It definitely is, and I think that the stakes get raised in a very logical, sound, and satisfying way. Um, you know, this whole sequence winds up with the characters ending up in the basement, and I think by that point in the movie, like they really create a genuine sense of hopelessness that you definitely don't expect. Um, it ends in a lighthearted way for sure, as a comedy probably should. but it gets to a point where you really start to question if that's going to happen. And that scene in the basement and stuff, it still has like a joke or two, but it starts to get pretty serious, and it's like kind of sad. You're like, oh my god, this genuinely feels apocalyptic. And I think that, I don't know, I just appreciate how it's able to do that and still end up being overall a funny, lightly enjoyable movie. I think it elevates itself by just taking it a little bit more seriously than you would expect it to, and than it really needs to. And it just adds to it. I think like with this cast of characters, it would have been very easy to just make this a total farce. And it definitely is that for a hefty portion of the film, but I think it's nice that they ground it at other parts. Now, another thing I like about this movie, this is just me, Edgar Wright films in general, the jukebox soundtrack here, the like kind of songs and music references they have, make me happy as a music fan. I liked the Smiths joke on the TV, and the joke where they're going through like his record collection and choosing which records to throw at the zombie. It's fun, but it also, another thing Edgar Wright's good at here is that you can tell he actually like knows about music to some degree. So when the characters are talking about music and they have conversations about music and they're listening to like UK rave stuff, and it's like pretty legit. And it's, it could just be me geeking out here, but I also like kind of liked how the characters feel more real because of that. Like they have genuine interests that the writer and director seem to actually have an understanding of, which is another thing you honestly don't see that much. Like you'll see characters who are into music or whatever in movies, but you can usually tell that the writer or whatever didn't know that much. And Shaun of the Dead's like very tuned in. Edgar Wright in general is very tuned in. And yeah, of course that song, that scene with the Queen song is very, very funny. And there are other funny scenes using music. I really like the scene where they're driving the car like completely carelessly through hordes of zombies and just running them over for fun. It's very, very, very good.
Yeah, one of the other things I wanted to mention, like to the characterization, is I really enjoy the way that we kind of alluded to it already, but the way that the characters feel so much like everybody's, not necessarily like superheroes or anything. They're just kind of people trapped in this situation. Like the one moment that kind of stands out for me, and that like it happens a couple times, but like specifically, they go to find his mom and his stepdad, and his stepdad at this point has already been bitten. And they're like, oh, well, we're going to wait for the doctor. And like, no, you can't wait for the doctor. Like, we have to go. And what I really like is like specifically, like the stepdad says a comment like, "Oh, don't worry about it. Like I ran it underwater. It'll be fine." So like those little tiny moments just make these characters feel like just like real people in a situation like this, like an out of hand situation, as opposed to like, the very upplayed stereotypes that typically happen within a horror film where you have like the very cliche, like to the extreme kind of personas. These are just like a group of people that get stuck in a zombie apocalypse that they're just trying to, figure out.
Yeah, and it's just funny because I really think that Shaun of the Dead is probably one of the best zombie films. It's not just a funny movie with zombies in it. Like it really is one of the best zombie films. It's and that is why, I think it being a comedy helps it a lot because it makes the characters just so much more personable. Out one flaw, and this is honestly just a personal thing, because I will say Shaun of the Dead is, when I really think about it, like this is a brilliant film. Every time I'm done watching it and I think about what I saw, I'm like, wow, that was so well done. I don't have many serious criticisms of the film other than just like a little bit of a personal thing, which is that this movie is a little bit broy for me. And like, that's the one thing that makes me not super connect with it. I think that's the one thing that will make some certain people really connect with it. Is the bro comedy element between Shaun and his friend, who is to the left of him on the movie poster. I never remember characters' names, but yeah, them two. They have this like bro Ed, right? They have this like bro relationship where they're both kind of, low lives and everyone's looking down on them or whatever. And Ed like farts and he plays video games, and they do feel like real people. And the performances are great and the writing is great, and I can't really find a flaw with it. It's just the one thing that makes me not personally connect with the movie. Like, I think oddly the one thing that would make a lot of people connect with it is the thing that holds me back. But yeah, and so that makes it like, for me, like getting super into the character dynamics and stuff is just like a slight disconnect. But that being said, I do want to say that I feel like of all the Edgar Wright films that I can remember in my head, this feels kind of like the best one. Like, its sense of style is almost unmatched. As a comedy film, like, the writing is so sharp, and as a horror zombie film, it even has some genuinely great moments there too. Surprisingly violent, bloody, and gory for what it is. No more than maybe your typical zombie fare, but certainly more than you would think going in. And yeah, just the directing and the acting and the writing and the editing especially, so good. It's such a sharp movie. It's like, it's hard to find anything really wrong with it, aside from like, just it not being my personal favorite film.
Yeah, other than that, I don't know if I have anything to add. I think we could probably wrap it up.
Sure, so I'm going to give it an 8. Though, again, I stress, I feel like the only thing holding me back is a personal thing on my end. Like, because this movie's really fucking good. And as I said, this is probably one of the best zombie films ever made, oddly enough. And one of the best horror comedies. I was comparing it to Brain Dead a lot early on, just because I remember talking about that last time, and I thought it was funny we're talking about another zombie comedy movie. But that movie I think I like more, because I think I just get more personal enjoyment watching the absolute insanity of that movie. But this is like probably the better put together, definitely the better put together movie. And I'm trying to even think of like a horror comedy film more well made than this, and I don't even know if I can, unless I'm just forgetting something big. But like, yeah, it's super good. I would definitely recommend it. I think like it's a great movie for Halloween too. Like Halloween times, it's a great movie to throw in there, because although it's funny, it'll lighten up your Halloween movie playlist, Halloween watch list, which is probably full of scary movies. This one still brings some genuine horror elements in it that make it fitting for the season. So I think it was a good, apt recommendation too on your part. That's all I have to say.
And I enjoy this one quite a bit. I think I'd go up to a 9 even. I think it's just a really enjoyable watch all around. As you mentioned, it's a great comedy. It's a great zombie movie. In a lot of ways, I feel like it's a better, just kind of more traditional zombie movie than a comedy. There are definitely comedic elements, but there's some really, emotionally gripping stuff here that's pretty fun to watch, and it gets pretty tense. I don't think it's for everyone, actually. I feel like, if I'm putting this up against something like even a Zombieland, I feel like in a lot of ways Zombieland is even lighter than this. So I just, everything we said, the characters are great, the writing is great, like a lot of the cinematography, it really just feels like you're kind of hanging out with the team at a bar, only you're surrounded by zombies.
Yeah,
so I definitely recommend it.
It's me and the boys hanging out in a pub in a zombie apocalypse.
Yep. Once we get the vaccines, we're going out to the pub.
Yeah, well, anyway, should we move on to what I recommended to you, Steven?
Yeah, let's do it.
Last time I recommended to Steven the film Halloween for our Halloween episode. Halloween is a Halloween film from 1978. It is a film directed by John Carpenter. I believe this was his 3rd film. Believe so, maybe 4th. John Carpenter would go on to direct The Thing, and well, I'm trying to think of other horror movies, but like They Live and stuff like that. Halloween eventually became a massive horror franchise. In fact, there's a new film out right now, which is part of a soft reboot franchise, but also technically a sequel to this film. It's called Halloween Kills. I've heard very bad things about it, but you know, that's how it is. Well, anyway, this is the original. It features Michael Myers. I'm sorry, Beatrice, not the Michael Myers you were thinking of. This is Michael Myers, the serial killer. Very sorry. She's still running though, so I think she's okay with that. I don't know. This film is often credited with starting the slasher craze. It wasn't the first slasher film, but it was the first slasher film to spark moviegoers' obsession with slasher movies leading into the 80s, where there was such an abundance of slasher films, and all the major slasher franchises that we think of exist pretty much because of this film, Halloween. So with that, I will let Steven talk about the film.
I think one thing that really stands out to me about this film is just how simple it is. Like, it is a very straightforward, straight played slasher movie. Now, I mean, at the time it makes sense. I'm thinking, like, there were definitely films before this that were most likely inspirations to Carpenter. Obviously, things like Psycho, if you want to go that far back, or even probably others as well. So that it's played as straight as it is doesn't surprise me. But there's something about that I really enjoy. It's just you're following a set of characters, primarily one character, but basically a group of teens as they're being stalked by a serial killer who's essentially recreating the first kill that he ever did when he was 6 years old. What I will say, I'm going to get to a criticism immediately. Not really necessarily a problem with the film itself, but I will say watching this film in 2021, it is pretty hokey. Like, a lot of a lot of the shots are kind of funny to watch now, and even a lot of the kills are pretty funny. But also I feel like that really ups its enjoyment factor. Like, even like in the very beginning, you're like in the eyes of Michael Myers at 6 years old as he's hunting down his sister, and he kills her with the kitchen knife. That scene of him like taking up the kitchen knife and then like slowly putting it down and her dying kind of like off the camera, it was very funny to me. And then also when he's standing out in front of his house and it like slow fades out and no one's doing anything for like 10 minutes.
Yeah, like they
Not
freeze frame
not
impersonally.
actually that long, but it felt like it. So there's some stuff here that's kind of funny, especially with the kills. A lot of the effects are pretty low grade, and I'm talking about effects even from like fake blood and that sort of thing. You can definitely tell. I will also say he's very efficient in that, I mean, like, he literally just runs the knife through somebody one time and they die. So he's very good at like finding the right kill spot, I guess. Like, the one specifically that I think of is the guy, I think his name is like Bob or something, and he kills him in the kitchen. He like chokes him like up on the wall and then like stabs him once and like pins him into the wall with a single knife stab, and the guy instantly dies. So he's very good at that. But I really enjoy the tension that this film creates, even with all that being said, as like hokey as it can be, as low effect as the effects can be. There's still a lot of tension here, which is obviously like the most important thing in a slasher film. Like, you're just following a group of characters trying to survive a serial killer, essentially. And if there's not tension, then you don't really feel like there's any stakes. But with Halloween, there's always stakes. And even the way that they kind of play into the start of his killing spree, like him stalking all of the individual characters in a car, like just out in public, behind a bush, like all of that really sets the tone for something that really very well grips you into then the one night where he's just like going on a rampage. Uh, I saw something that said, they basically had this theory that his killing is like some sort of sexual frustration or something. Obviously, he's killing a lot of teenagers who are having sex or trying to have sex with each other. Um, I thought that was interesting because it's certainly true, but I'm not sure that I think that Carpenter's come out and basically said, no, not really. But it certainly is the case that all these teens are just trying to have sex with each other, and Michael Myers is going around killing everybody.
And he did kill his sister after she had sex when he was a kid.
Right.
So that's, I think, where the theory comes from. Yeah. And I mean, it's funny because that trope became like the thing every slasher film had to do. Like, teenagers have sex and then they die. And it's like, I don't even think, yeah, it's like, it doesn't even seem like that was actually the point of this movie, but that became like the thing that slashers did. Really, everything that this movie did became the things that slashers did. But I feel like it learned a lot. I feel like a lot of those movies learned the wrong lesson from Halloween. You're right. I definitely agree the film could be quite hokey. There are scenes in here that are just downright silly. The entire concept.
I will say specifically, one of the things I want to call out is like sometimes where he's just like standing at a distance, like just standing there, he looks kind of funny.
Yeah, and the funniest part to me is the concept of Michael Myers stealing his sister's tombstone and then dragging it up the stairs after he kills two teens to set up a little scene where he lays one of them out on the bed and puts the tombstone over her with some candles. It's just very funny. It's very odd. And there are other corny things that happen in the movie, but it's also a very low budget film. And I think that's kind of one of the most admirable things about it. I think this movie does so much with so little. It really does a lot. And despite that corniness, I will say I found Halloween to be pretty scary. I don't usually get affected by horror films like that. I mean, some great ones definitely can get me, but I found this to be a film that actually was pretty scary. And no other slasher film is. Okay, I can't think of a single other slasher film or slasher adjacent movie that is. And one of the reasons for that is that I think, one, John Carpenter is just so good at building tension. You know, this movie is so slow at points. Other slasher films can be so methodical, like to the way they build up to kills and the characters they'll set up just to die. You know, in most slasher movies, honestly, the joy of watching them is that you just want to see people die. Like, that's why you watch Nightmare on Elm Street. You want to see the creative kills, you know. That's why you watch Friday the 13th. You just want to see schlock and people dying. Like, that's the appeal of the slasher genre, I feel like. But Halloween doesn't really come across that way, you know. Despite the fact that I will say, like, aside from Jamie Lee Curtis, the other lead characters, there's nothing really special about them, and some of the acting and dialogue can be pretty not great. But, like, you don't want to see them die. And the way they build up to these deaths, it's so slow. There are so many scenes of characters just doing meaningless stuff, and the only reason we're watching it is the knowledge that they might get killed by Michael Myers. They might. But in most of these scenes, they don't. And even when they do, it's always like so much later than you expect them to. Especially if you've seen any other slasher films that came later, where you know when the death's gonna happen. You know, like as soon as the scene starts up, you know, this is the death scene. This is when the death's gonna happen. You see the set pieces. You have a good idea of what the gore is gonna be. You know, where the kill's gonna happen. Ooh, there's a, you know, sewing machine. I can't think of a movie that actually uses a sewing machine. But if you were watching a slasher and you saw a sewing machine, you'd think, oh, they're gonna use that, you know? Like, whatever silly thing you can think of. But Halloween really isn't like that. Like, it's so... The simplicity adds a lot to it, you know? He's just killing people with a knife and strangling them, and that's it. And because of that, the build-up is just, like, so dry. And I found that actually pretty effective. The entire scene where Jamie Lee Curtis is investigating the house across the street after the kills have happened, it's so dark, you can barely see anything, and it's so slow. The movie just does such a good job of dragging out all these scenes. And because it's established before that Michael Myers is kind of this weird enigma, like he'll just stand around and stare at people, and like you don't really know what his intentions or motivations are. And even as the film starts to explain him, they just say he's pure evil and that's it. And that's pretty scary when you compare it to other slasher villains who, you know, have some kind of vendetta or some kind of like idea in their head or some kind of way that they kill. Michael Myers just fucking does it just cuz. And it's like because of that, you never really know what's coming. Um and I think this movie plays on that all like really really well. I think that's why for me I found it pretty effective. And it's also just, again, it's like a very darkly lit movie. There's a lot of really dark scenes, which is always good in a horror movie.
Yeah, now one thing I'll say that I wasn't a fan of, uh, to a certain point, like up until a certain point, there's no necessary indication that Michael Myers is some sort of like superhuman, right? He was a child that murdered, and we get a good understanding or some, ancillary understanding of this person's psyche. They have a psychiatrist that says they're basically too far gone. They want them locked up forever and that sort of a thing. And obviously, this person is quite strong and good at choking and somehow learned how to drive and is also good at stabbing. But none of that necessarily would lead us as an audience to believe that they have some sort of supernatural ability. Until basically the movie kind of uses it to build extra tension, right? Jamie Lee Curtis thinks she's killed the killer and he's not really dead. Okay, maybe, getting stabbed with a pin needle, he might come back. Maybe even kind of getting stabbed with a clothes hanger. Maybe even getting stabbed with a knife, he can come back. But that he gets shot multiple times and kind of just like walks it off, we have no indication that that is something that really makes any sense. Like the world is not built in such a way to make us believe that there should be somebody that's like superhuman in this scenario. And I feel like that really took me out of the situation because what I enjoyed so much was to that point, basically, this was just a very deranged serial killer that was going around and being very effective at killing a whole bunch of teenagers, essentially. But then he basically, by the end of the movie, becomes something more than that, becomes like this super monster, right? And there's some tie to that. They talk about the boogeyman a lot, and they refer to this person as the boogeyman, and that he is like able to kind of walk all this off only amplifies that. But it really sort of took me out of the whole thing that just kind of out of nowhere, this guy becomes superhuman. And then now there's like 11 of them.
Oh yeah, I can definitely understand that. What do you think about the very ending though?
I mean, I think the thing is, like, I think the ending is good, right? And like setting up that this person is still there and they, the psychiatrist sees that he's gone, and we almost get the sense that the psychiatrist knew that that was going to be the case. And kind of Jamie Lee Curtis really does a great job of like just like kind of relief. But I don't know, still to me, it felt too like hammed into the situation that he is like some supernatural being.
Yeah, that makes sense. I definitely understand that. Well, here's what I'll say about the finale sequence. I don't know. I don't mind that aspect of it. And I think in this film they leave it open-ended enough. Like he has to be supernatural. It's kind of the only explanation you can have for how he keeps doing this. But it's open-ended enough where it's just kind of like, wow, this serial killer, there's something crazy going on here. And then, that's kind of it. And for me, that's fine. Like I I really 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 love the ending of the movie when we've already been spoiling it, it's whatever, but he gets shot, falls off the balcony, and then he appears back. I just got a fucking Streamlabs notification from Twitch. That's interesting. Anyway, I didn't know that translated onto YouTube. Hello. Anyway, that threw me off. Was I saying? Yeah, so he falls off the balcony, and then next thing you know, he's not there anymore. And I really, like, it's such a cool ending because then what they do is they just cut to a bunch of like shots of dark rooms that you've seen, and the movie just ends like that, which is like really freaky because it's just kind of like, wow, he's out there somewhere, and that's how the movie ends. I really like that about it. I think what sucks about it is that there's a second one, which I'm never
Yeah.
gonna watch. I'm never gonna watch any of these other movies. I don't care. I think it's dumb that there's sequels. I've heard they're bad
Well, the
anyway.
second one got retconned, and now the
That's
newest
true.
first of the trilogy is the new sequel.
I know about that. Yeah. Well, apparently there's a lot of retconning in the Halloween franchise. It's actually I've seen the timeline for it, and it's very convoluted, which is just weird. But anyway, I think this ending works because it. Well, I can't say because, but in theory it works because there is no conclusion to it. You know, that's what makes it effective. Like, you're looking at all these dark places, imagining he's somewhere out there, and that's just it. And horror movies are always good when they end on a note like that. It's I don't really think it's ever good to end on too light of a note. I think that can kind of kill the suspense of the movie. They do a really good job with that. But what I would like to say about the finale, that ending is brilliant, I think. But this whole final sequence is one of the most famous and iconic parts of the movie, although for me it was kind of one of the weakest. I don't know how you felt. You have this whole sequence where Jamie Lee Curtis, gets Michael Myers into her house, and she's got the kid she's babysitting, which is, I like that they're there. It definitely makes it scarier because you're like, oh, you really want them to survive and everything. But it's famous for this final scene where she's like trying to outwit and kill Michael Myers. She's getting chased by him in her own house. She's in the closet. Very famous sequence there where, like, the lights only come through the little shades and the closet doors. It's great. The tension there is great. But this sequence is kind of killed by how stupid I feel like she acts. And, people complain about this in horror movies a lot because a lot of them do this where they just kind of have the lead act really dumb. But it's not dumb in that she's being illogical, right? Because she would be illogical. This is a very scary, crazy situation, and she's a teenager, right? She would be illogical. But that they don't even have her acting illogically in a way that, like, makes sense with her being scared, because she's got Michael Myers in her house. She stabs him with like this big like pin needle through his neck, and after she does that, without even looking to see if he's dead yet, she just kind of chills for a moment, like, yes, I've done it, and then, like, all she did was stab him with the pin needle. You'd think if she's really that scared, she'd like fucking run or something, Even if she runs somewhere dumb, you'd think she'd go somewhere, but she doesn't. She also, like, kind of just leaves the knife for him. And, like, she sees he's dead. She thinks he's dead, and she goes upstairs to the kids, and she gets them out of the house, but she stays in the house, which is pretty crazy because, she's so scared. You'd think, again, she'd leave and call someone or something. But, at this point, these dumb decisions are a little bit forgivable. I feel like it gets really insane after the closet scene where she stabs him in the eye with like a clothesline, and then she stabs him once with the knife, and he's down again, and she thinks he's dead again, but this has already happened. She's already seen him like looking like he's dead. But she throws the knife next to him and she sits in front of him and she doesn't even watch him. And I feel like at this point, it's not even just that she's making dumb decisions. It's like she's not even acting like a scared teenager anymore, The first time it's forgivable, but like now that you can stab this guy and he can get up again. And you're still gonna just sit like right next to him. It kind of killed it for me because while I will say the shot where she's sitting in front of him and he like gets up, very iconic. It's like silent. It's great. John Carpenter is just a good director, But like the script writing here and like the character motivations just don't make sense to me. It made the whole thing kind of unbelievable.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, to my earlier point, what makes it that much more unbelievable to me is that, like, this person who we had no indication of to this point was some sort of supernatural, like, can live through anything being, is now like getting up multiple times from being stabbed as well. So you have everything that you just mentioned. I 100% agree. Plus the fact that, like, all of a sudden he becomes this superhuman kind of took me out of that whole ending part. For me, really, the greatest parts of this movie are like the whole like build up of Michael Myers as a character, not necessarily the stuff at the psych ward, but once they start kind of showing everyone at school and Michael Myers is stalking them, and then all of the kills in the other house, all of that to me is just incredible to watch. Really great. Incredible character building, really great tension, a lot of great shots and cinematography, and just the way that they utilize like very, common props, and the way you have these characters who are just teenagers and kids kind of like writing off different events that are happening that could lead someone to believe that something's going on. All of that's really great. And yeah, I agree that there are really great shots in all the final stuff with Jamie Lee Curtis's character. With all the stuff with the two kids in like the original house. But to me, I'm with you. It's like I don't feel like that's the strongest of what's on display here.
Yeah, I think that sequence basically shows off John Carpenter's directing skills, which it definitely does do. Maybe more than any other part in the movie. But yeah, it falls apart in every other kind of way. I will say this though, I still like it, like, because Jamie Lee Curtis in this movie is just so good, like her performance in this movie is so good. Also, Donald Pleasance, right, the actor who's the psychiatrist, so good, like so simple. But he's just the guy who stands around and explains Michael Myers. So simple, but his performance really sells it.
Yeah, honestly, his character, the majority of what his character does is just stand by a house.
Yeah.
Like, that's it.
Yeah, he tells some kids to fuck off at one point in a really weird way. It's very silly, but he works. A lot of the movie's very silly, but it works, It's... I think the last thing I want to say about the movie, I mean, I don't mean to wrap it up if you're not ready to, but I feel like we are. The last thing I want to say about the movie is that a lot of people definitely don't like this movie anymore. Like, I think a lot of new viewers probably aren't going to get a ton out of it. I've definitely heard people say they didn't like it, they didn't get it. And I think one of the main reasons for that is that this movie is one of those movies that gets copied so much, where like the language that this movie came up with, it's almost like Citizen Kane. Not to say Halloween's on the level of Citizen Kane, but like it's a similar situation where it's like everything that it did that made it so great, everything that it did that made it so unique and interesting, just got sucked into like all the other movies that we know and we've seen so much, to the point where you see them like this and you don't even register them really. So what you're left with is a movie where either you're gonna really feel the tension and see the quality directing and movie making here, or you're not, and that's kind of it. Because as a slasher film, if you even like slasher films, it's really basic. If you're looking for kills and stuff, that they're not really great in this movie. That's not really the point, There's some fun stuff there, I guess, with him like in a bedsheet ghost costume or whatever. They do some hammy stuff, but nothing compared to what like other slasher movies do. And it's not very creative with any of that either. But for me, honestly, that's what makes it stand out, because it just has the simplicity and it's still like really effective at a lot of what it tries to do. Yeah.
Yeah, well, with that, I think I'll start wrapping it up. I enjoyed it a lot. I think that there's a lot to like here. A lot of the cinematography, a lot of the character building, the soundtrack obviously is incredible. And, I do think it's hokey at times. There are some parts that I didn't like with Michael Myers' character specifically, but the kills, while not extraordinary, are really fun, and they build them in such a way that make them more interesting. And the performance of Jamie Lee Curtis is really great too. So ultimately, I'd say I give this movie an 8. I would recommend it. I think that it's worth a watch. I don't think, watching it this day and age, it might not have the same impact as it would if you were watching it before. Even watching it now, like I mentioned, a lot of the effects are pretty light. A lot of the scenes are kind of hammy in a fun way. So you might get a little more laugh out of it than the movie might expect you to, but I think it's worth seeing kind of where the bones of a lot of our modern, and especially as you mentioned, a lot of the 80s slasher films like Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Chucky, those sorts of things come from.
Yeah, I would also give the film an 8. And like I said, I honestly thought it was pretty scary rewatching it, which you know, I shouldn't say horror films don't generally scare me, but slasher films don't. Like, these movies are fucking funny. You watch them to have fun and watch people die and go, whoa, holy shit, you know? And Halloween's just not like that. It's just, it's a lot more chilling, a lot more slow, and a lot more unnerving and suspenseful than a lot of those movies are. And it's just simple in a really great way. Very, very strong directing and filmmaking, but, you know, a lot of corniness along the way, too. And some dumb stuff, for sure. And yeah, I think in certain departments it's been overshadowed by later films, but I still think it stands up. When I say certain departments, I mean things that I personally don't care about as much, like you know, I guess like more popcorn like pacing, you know, death after death to give you that kind of burst and that satisfaction. Later slasher films perfected that definitely much more than this movie does. But again, I think that makes it work. I would definitely recommend it. I mean, I think like you should watch it. It's kind of one of those like essential horror films. But I do add the caveat that like it's also one of those movies that's been eaten up. The language of the film's been eaten up by so much that you've already seen if you haven't seen this movie. That like watching it with that knowledge, it just might not really stand out to you, which is definitely an understandable thing. But it's still worth the watch. You know, it's a good movie. And anyway, we'll move into our recommendations if you're good to. And Steven, you can go first. These are not horror recommendations anymore. The horror is actually ending, and with that, I'll let our house guests out. And first, I'll let out our new friends.
Party's over, everyone.
Yeah, I'm so sorry, Glenda.
We just played the Ghostbusters theme for the last time.
Listen, Glenda, you're really cool. Your dance inspiring, but you gotta go. Beatrice, I'm sorry that, you know, Michael Myers from SNL wasn't here. I don't know what to tell you.
Big fan of Shrek, Beatrice.
Lance never really got to stab anyone, neither last time nor this time, but you never know. Maybe one Halloween. Gary, what can you say? You know, professional baller.
Still just throwing a nasty curve. I mean, how are you going to read that as a hitter?
Lindsay was playing delightful melodies into my ear this whole time. And so shout out, you know. Mr. P, I don't know what to tell you, dude. I really don't. I'm glad you have a hobby, which is manifesting the letter P from your pelvis. Mallory's personal favorite of mine, you know, sneaky dude. I love you. We love you. Ashley and Zoe, what's there to say? They're just hanging out. And Billy, I mean,
synchronized routine is just impeccable, truly.
That's true. And Billy's just silly, you know. So shout out to Billy, the silly Billy with the very
OG.
silly arms. The OG. That's true. And anyway, we will now. The horror is slowly leaving. And with that, we'll get into recommendations.
The blood is coming out of your eyes, finally. And I will, with that, recommend for next episode a video game. We talk about them kind of rarely, I would say. They are a little harder for us, just a little peek behind the curtain, a little harder for us to recommend, obviously, because we only have so much time to dedicate to trying out recommendations between podcast episodes. So with video games, obviously, especially a lot of the longer or bigger titles require a lot more time investment than anything else we talk about, unless we were to start recommending something like books or audiobooks or something. But I will recommend a video game called, and it's pretty recent, Super Auto Pets. Super Auto Pets is a game that I believe came out this year. I know for sure it came to Steam this year. It is a free-to-play auto battler, which has become quite popular within the last few years, starting with Auto Chess, which was a Dota 2 mod, and then pretty much all of the MOBAs kind of took on their own spin on the auto battler, and now auto battlers have become more standardized with things like Hearthstone picking them up and also becoming more common language in other genres like roguelites and anything you can really think of. Super Auto Pets, I would say, is probably the most or the easiest to get into as a starter of the genre. It is available both on IO, um, where you can actually play it in browser, or as I mentioned, it did come to Steam, I believe, like at this point, a couple months ago, and also is available on the App Store in the Android store. So next time we will talk about Super Auto Pets.
All right, sounds great. And for next time, Stephen, I am recommending to you the film 2001: A Space Odyssey. 2001: A Space Odyssey is a 1968 sci-fi film directed by Stanley Kubrick. It's based on a short story by Arthur C. Clarke. Um, I don't know what else there is to say about it, so that's what I'm recommending to you for next time. And with that, all that said, thank you so much for watching Get Recc'd, or listening. Well, I suppose we're a podcast, so I really should say listening. If you are listening on Castbox, I apologize that you couldn't see our skeleton friends. But if you'd like to see our skeleton friends, hop on over to YouTube. We stream these podcasts to YouTube at the YouTube channel Casting 404. We always stream them live with a live chat. So you can come and listen live and on Halloween, see the skeletons. If you
And I don't know if we've mentioned this, but maybe it goes without needing mention. If you're curious to ever watch an episode, all the VODs are available on the YouTube channel as well. So if you are listening on Castbox and want to see a VOD or just check in to be able to see our spooky friends, you can always go to the channel and watch the VOD. You do not necessarily have to watch live.
That is absolutely true. And if you'd like to listen to us on the go, we are on Castbox. You can download the Castbox app and listen to the podcast from there. You can follow us on Castbox at Get Recc'd. And I try to get them up on Castbox whenever I think about it, basically. So if you don't see an episode up on there, it'll probably be up on there eventually. And that's all that I really have to say about that. Thank you for watching our spooky episode. Stephen, do you have anything to conclude with?
No, as always, thank you for watching and listening. Of course, this was our very spooky episode, as you have mentioned.
Yeah, and we apologize for scaring you so much. But, it's Halloween. You have to, And with that said, those were our thoughts. Those were our recommendations. Get Recc'd.